that being said, those whether it's one of those two topics, something else, what do you think kind of is the unique secret sauce or whatever that you're providing at Assembly Ventures?
No, it's a great first question. And I think the framework that any one of us or us together as a community approach how we're going to be sustainable investors is super important. And it's not something that necessarily is talked about a lot. We talk about amazing entrepreneurs, amazing individual business plans that are addressing a component part of. But what we tried to do is step back and say, what is the right way to maximize impact, to maximize value creation, and to ensure that we're actually bringing the right stakeholders together. So as you pointed out, Brandon, we don't believe it's case or aces because you have kind of this convolution of both business plans and technology platforms. We put forth something called ISA with infrastructure at the bedrock of the future of mobility, both physical and digital, the systems layer that connects the physical and the digital, kind of the bytes and the atoms, the heartbeat of the system, if you will, and the application layers that allows for customer interaction and monetization. And so when it comes to sustainability, I guess the way that I would kick off the discussion, and I think Gabriel has a unique background as well, so I'm excited to see how kind of the back and forth. And I guess over the last decade, you've seen a lot of investors very focused on auto tech as a segment or logistics as a segment, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we're big believers that it's the intersections of these huge Venns or these huge segments globally that are going to find the most innovation, the most value, and the most impact. So when I look at traditional auto, new auto suppliers, pure tech, infrastructure providers, insurance and financial tech, kind of providers, and the incumbents in those spaces, I'm looking at where are the companies that are doing things that will serve many of them at the same time. And then the other thing that I'm very focused on are what are the second and third order effects of the investment that you're making today. So if you think, I was just in Dubai last week, and I had the chance to talk about kind of the future of autonomy, as well as the future of kind of investing in this space. And one of the questions I got after the fact was, are autonomy really going to bring us huge impacts to sustainability? And my answer was not yet. And I think it's because we have to think about the vehicle propellant is electrified. We have to think about the overall energy supply chain and how that energy is being created. We have to think about what are we tracking and the mobility options we're giving to consumers, and not in any way to force anyone into a specific mode or point to point, but to provide options that frankly are just more economical and have a better impact overall. So I think for us, it's very important to be holistic and to do so not only with the investments we're making, but with the partnerships we're striking. And I think we're seeing a really fantastic time right now where entrepreneurs have much more power to negotiate the types of investors they bring on, because they're the ones that are holding, frankly, the keys to the kingdom that really have a chance to make a lot of change.
Yeah, and Gabriel, I'll be interested to hear your opinion, I guess, with the other context I would offer. So one of the things from the discussion with Danielle that really stood out was how you guys are really focused on, technology creation is great, but the successful implementation and what this actually looks like is a bedrock of how you're actually approaching this. So I'm curious to hear how are you thinking similar to what Chris, and what else, where are you maybe differing on this approach?
Yeah, you captured it really well, actually, Brandon, in the sort of wrap there, which is, yes, the technology, yes, the entrepreneurs. We're very strong believers in the entrepreneurial ability to change things and the need for that. The piece we would add to that would be the and you mentioned intersection, Chris, the intersection with communities, the places where this technology will actually be deployed, the people who will be impacted by the technologies we're deploying. How will we engage with that? We have a model called the Square Partnerships model, which really looks at sort of, there's the technology piece, there's the funding piece, there's the customer piece, and then there's the community around the technologies that are being deployed. And I think a lot of this is, how do we make our communities better? How do we make things work better using these new technologies, using the massive amounts of funding that are going into it? I mean, you mentioned earlier the funding. This year, if you're kind of paying attention, the amount of money, VC money going into mobility tech is just crazy. $70+ billion is by some estimates this year alone. So I mean, amazing amounts of money. How will it impact the communities that are actually served by or around the things that are being deployed? It's one of the big things we look at.
Because it seemed like when you were hearing that, maybe you had something to say, but anything you want to add there? Otherwise, I could.
No, I think that's spot on. I think what you're hearing from both of us, which is always exciting for me, is that it's about bringing together genuine stakeholders that believe in maybe not the exact same mission, but many of the same outputs. And I think that's what I get excited about with the capital that's coming in today. I remember 12 years ago when I founded my first firm and we were the first firm really investing in mobility. And I tell people that and they're like, oh, you're investing in telephony. And I'm like, no. And they're like, well, you're investing in something that makes no sense. Why would you invest in transportation with long lead times and governmental sales cycles and no upside? And that paradigm has completely changed, which is good. And now we have a chance, I think, with those resources to have an impact that is both, a great investment, but of equal importance, a great outcome.
And Gabriel, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. So hearing about this, I think makes a ton of sense to me, and think about this holistically, taking a systems level view kind of the mobility, and I think taking the approach of what's the most efficient way for goods, people, data to move, as opposed to thinking about in terms of technology is makes a ton of sense. But it also, I'd say the implementation is the degree of complexity is significantly higher when we start thinking in these terms. And like I think of someone like Lime, right, or a micro mobility company. If you have the goal of just let's get scooters out there and have as many rides as possible, that's a pretty cut and dry goal that you can work towards, and you can check the box and you can make meaningful progress. But that's also not what you're talking about. You guys are talking about here, right? You guys are talking about how are we actually making an impact, and how are these companies playing a role within the greater ecosystem? So how do you try to balance when you're thinking in this holistic terms, how do you try to actually make sure you're making progress?
Your question is perfect, right? Because with Lime, when you look at when we first launched, we were Lime Bike at the time, and we started deploying vehicles. And I was hired the second month of the company's existence. So we were already thinking from the beginning about engaging with government. We need to be engaged with policymakers and helping figure out how does this solve bigger goals than just revenue for this company or rides for this specific customer. As we deployed, I think the central thesis, and certainly my sort of effort was, as I talked to government officials, look, we're going to collect data off of these bikes that are rolling through your city, and we're going to share that data with you, and that's going to enable you to make new decisions around infrastructure planning. For example, you'll see that rides went here and there, and maybe they jogged around this particular place. What does that tell us? Is there a barrier to riding safely in that area? What's going on in your city? And some cities immediately got it. I remember speaking to one mayor in particular where within a minute, she was like, wait a minute, you're telling me you'll get new constituents riding who will validate my assumptions around where we want to go and where we want to build better infrastructure. It's like, yes. And she said, great, how fast can we go? Other cities had a harder time really getting their heads around it. You're capturing data, and yeah, we already know where people ride. We've done surveys and stuff, and that's true. But I think to your point, the ecosystem, I was certainly naive going in with Lime thinking, boy, we'll provide this data and everything will change. And we saw ridership, right? We proved that there is demand, or you could induce demand for this different mobility option and this different way of getting around. What we didn't see necessarily was the policy support to go with it. So many cities saw immediately the externalities, and I mentioned communities in my first sort of piece of this. We saw people adopt this, and a lot of people were really happy about it. It also created new problems, right? People left them in odd places, intentionally or otherwise, which created barriers for people who had sight difficulties, for example. Sometimes they were hung from trees, which is simply weird. We saw all sorts of stuff, intentional and otherwise, again, but it's creating these external things in the community, which, new problems to solve, solvable problems in many cases. But to solve some of the bigger picture problems, specifically around parking or sidewalk riding, takes collaboration across ecosystem partners. So, the companies can do a certain amount. All the companies out there in micromobility are trying to figure out how do we geofence, how do we control where people can go. But at the end of the day, we need better infrastructure to support this stuff, right? We need designated parking areas, or technology to guide parking behaviors. And you see some interesting examples from startups like Drover, for example, is pushing people to park in certain ways. I don't know if that's the right solution, frankly. I really think a lot of it comes down to parking infrastructure provided by cities, just like we have for cars. The same thing around parking riding, right? People jump to sidewalk riding because they don't feel safe in the car side right of way. So that tells us we need safer infrastructure. And so again, how can we use the data that these companies can provide, partnered with ecosystem partners for telling us where to go and where would be safe to place things, and then the city side, the policy side. And I think this can be extrapolated across a lot of different industries. It's great to sort of innovate technology, and we created this new thing, but how does it fit into the greater ecosystem? What challenges will it create, and who do we partner with to solve some of those challenges?
And Brandon, just one thing that I double tap, and I think Gabriel, you're spot on with that need to focus on infrastructure, and it's still something that we're not seeing, in our opinion, nearly enough focus on. So you have incumbent providers that are looking to go after these types of new ways of digitizing, but they don't necessarily have the technology in-house to do that. So some are going down these big build processes, when we would argue that there's near-term partnerships available with really innovative young startups. And let's figure out ways to actually get more bang for our buck within an established kind of, geofence or whatever, wherever they're deploying to do things faster. And I think, Vince, the work that you're working on, we talked about this little in the breakout session, like how are we thinking about traditional propulsion and fueling within kind of a pieces of real estate that they don't need to think about this tomorrow, they have to think about it today. And that's where we get really excited in seeing that intersection between the old and the new, and ways in which the incumbents can really become, in our opinion, the champions of the digitization of infrastructure, but there has to be a focus on it.
And actually, can I build on that for a second, Brandon? I think one of the things that's really interesting, again, is it's easy to fixate on technology. We can solve this problem with technology, we can solve that problem. And that's true. We do need a lot of that, right? Like, I think estimates I've seen is something like 35% of carbon solutions haven't been created yet. 65% we can use existing technology. But I think a big piece of things is helping your average person or your policymaker cross what I consider to be kind of an imagination gap to see how this actually makes anything better. How does this make my life better? So for example, with bikes, when we first rolled those out, we had a backlash immediately against bikes because there are people who just don't like bikes for whatever reason, particularly in the United States. With scooters, we didn't see that in the beginning. At the beginning of scooters, I would say almost always the reaction was, "Whoa, this is cool." And I think a lot of it's because either you were a kid when you had a Razor scooter, or your friends had Razor scooters, or you had a kid or a grandkid. And so you could kind of relate to it in a way that was fun and different. And it helped people kind of jump across that gap of, why would I want to do this? Well, the why is because it's fun. It makes my life somehow better. And of course, we had backlash come with scooters, and all sorts of externalities. I'm not pretending that they're perfect. However, what we saw at the beginning was people were able to jump over that imagination gap to how this could make my life better, which I think is a lot of what technology needs to sell in a lot of these cases, is how does this help the communities in which it's deployed? It's not just a technology solution. It's not just about VC dollars. It's about how do we make life better?